Welcome, dear listeners, to this cozy audiobook adventure in the style of the great Agatha Christie. I'm delighted to present Miss Marple Solves the Deadly Corpse in the Village Well, a tale of intrigue set in the charming village of St. Mary Mead during the post-war years. Join our sharp-witted elderly detective as she unravels a puzzling mystery with her keen eye for human nature. Settle in with a cup of tea and let the story unfold. Narrated for your enjoyment, this is a complete 5-chapter mystery. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Body in the Well. In the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead, where time seemed to linger like morning mist over the dew-kissed meadows, life unfolded with the predictable rhythm of a well-wound grandfather clock. It was the early 1950s, a time when the scars of the war were fading but not forgotten, and the villagers clung to their traditions amid the subtle encroachments of modernity. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and lattices of climbing roses, lined the narrow lanes like sentinels of a bygone era. The ancient church of St. Mary, its spire piercing the sky like a needle through fabric, stood as the heart of the community, where bells tolled for weddings, funerals, and the simple passage of hours. The village green, a verdant expanse bordered by hedgerows and dotted with benches where elderly residents exchanged pleasantries, was the hub of daily life. Here, the post office buzzed with gossip, the bakery emitted the comforting aroma of fresh scones, and the Blue Boar Inn offered respite with its foaming pints of ale. Children played cricket on the grass in summer, while in autumn, as now, the leaves turned to shades of gold and crimson, carpeting the ground like a patchwork quilt. It was a place where secrets were as rare as they were deeply buried, for in St. Mary Mead, everyone knew, or thought they knew, everyone else's affairs. At the centre of this idyllic scene stood the old village well, a stone structure dating back to medieval times. Its walls, encrusted with moss and lichen, whispered tales of centuries past. The well was no longer the primary source of water, thanks to the advent of piped supplies, but it remained a functional relic, its cool spring water prized for its purity. Villagers occasionally drew from it for special occasions, like brewing tea for the church fete or watering prize flower beds. Little did they suspect that on this crisp October morning, it would become the stage for a drama more sinister than any the village had seen in decades. Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster who resided in Danemead Cottage on the edge of the green, was a figure as integral to St. Mary Mead as the well itself. Now in her 70s, with snow-white hair neatly pinned beneath a sensible hat and a fluffy shawl perpetually draped over her frail shoulders, she presented an image of harmless eccentricity. Her days were spent in quiet pursuits, tending her small garden where dahlias bloomed in defiant splendor, or knitting intricate patterns that seemed to mirror the complexities of the human mind. To the casual observer, she was merely old Miss Marple, prone to dozing in her armchair by the window, a pair of spectacles perched on her nose as she perused the daily newspaper. But those who underestimated her did so at their peril. Miss Marple possessed an intellect as keen as the edge of a Sheffield blade, sharpened by a lifetime of observing the nuances of human behaviour. She had never married, nor ventured far from the village, yet her understanding of people rivaled that of any worldly traveller. Human nature is the same everywhere, she often remarked to her nephew, Raymond West, the successful author who visited sporadically from London. Whether in a bustling city or a quiet hamlet, people reveal themselves in the smallest of details. A glance, a hesitation, a misplaced word. Her blue eyes, twinkling with quiet amusement, missed nothing. From her vantage point by the window, she watched the comings and goings of her neighbours, piecing together puzzles that others scarcely noticed. On this particular morning, Miss Marple was seated in her sunlit parlour, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a baby blanket for the vicar's expectant niece. The wireless played softly in the background, broadcasting the latest news from the BBC, something about rationing easing and the promise of a brighter future. Outside, the autumn sun cast a golden glow over the green, and birds chirped merrily in the branches of the ancient oak tree. It was a scene of perfect serenity, soon to be shattered. The first hint of disturbance came with the sound of hurried footsteps and a boy's frantic cry. Young Tommy Pierce, the baker's apprentice, no more than 14 with freckles across his nose and a cap perpetually askew, had been dispatched to fetch water from the well for the morning's dough. Bucket in hand, he approached the stone rim, peering down into the shadowy depths. What he expected to see was the glimmer of clear water. What he found instead was a sight that would haunt his dreams for weeks. There, floating face down in the shallow pool, no more than 4 feet deep, was the body of a man. His tailored suit, now sodden and clinging, identified him immediately to Tommy as Mr. Reginald Hargrove, the wealthy retired banker who had taken up residence in the Grand Manor House just 6 months prior. Hargrove had arrived from London with a reputation for shrewd investments and a demeanour that bordered on aloof. He was a tall man, in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed moustache and a penchant for expensive cigars, which he smoked while strolling the lanes in the evening. Tommy's scream pierced the air like a siren's wail. He dropped the bucket with a clatter and bolted toward the bakery, his legs pumping furiously. "Mr. Baker, Mr. Baker, there's a dead man in the well. It's Mr. Hargrove. He's drowned." Word spread through the village with the speed of a brush fire. Within minutes, a crowd gathered around the well. Curious housewives in aprons, farmers pausing from their chores, and even the schoolmaster, Mr. Humphreys, who had dismissed his class early. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Poor soul must have slipped in the dark. But why was he out at night? Accidents happen, even to the careful. Constable Henry Slack, the local policeman, arrived on his bicycle, his uniform slightly rumpled from a hasty departure. A sturdy man in his 40s with a no-nonsense moustache and a notebook perpetually at the ready, Slack took charge with his usual brusque efficiency. "Stand back, all of you. This is police business." He leaned over the well, confirming the grim discovery, then radioed for assistance from the nearby town of Much Benham. As the villagers watched, 2 burly farmhands were enlisted to haul the body out using ropes and a makeshift pulley. The corpse was laid gently on the grass, water pooling beneath it. Hargrove's face was pallid, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. There were no obvious signs of violence, no bruises, no blood, but his expression held a frozen grimace, as if his final moments had been ones of surprise or pain. Slack knelt to examine him, noting the absence of any wallet or personal effects, though that could have been lost in the water. By now, Miss Marple had ventured from her cottage, her walking stick tapping softly on the path as she approached the scene. She positioned herself at the edge of the crowd, unobtrusive yet observant, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Her neighbour, the formidable Mrs. Price Ridley, a widow known for her unyielding opinions and her role as chair of the Women's Institute, sidled up to her. "Dreadful, isn't it, Jane? Simply dreadful. I always said that well was a hazard. Mark my words, it was an accident. He must have been tipsy after dinner at the inn. Miss Marple nodded politely, but her mind was already whirring. Perhaps, Dolly dear, but Mr. Hargrove struck me as a temperate man, and the well is well lit by the lamppost nearby. One wonders. As the doctor, young Raymond West's friend, Dr. Haydock, arrived to pronounce death, the crowd hushed. Dr. Haydock, a kindly man with a reassuring bedside manner, conducted a preliminary examination. No water in the lungs, he announced quietly to Slack. He didn't drown. Heart failure, perhaps. But wait, there's something odd about the pupils. I'll need to autopsy. Whispers intensified. Heart failure, in a healthy man like Hargrove. Miss Marple overheard snippets. Hargrove had been seen arguing with the vicar over church donations just days ago, and hadn't he lent money to the innkeeper, Mr. Potts, who was struggling with debts? Then there was his young wife, the glamorous Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove, 20 years his junior, who had been spotted in animated conversation with the handsome Dr. West himself. By afternoon, the autopsy results trickled back via the constable. Traces of digitalis, a heart medication derived from the foxglove plant, were found in lethal quantities. Poison, not accident. The well had been used to dispose of the body, perhaps to simulate drowning. The village reeled. Who in peaceful St. Mary Mead could commit such an act? Miss Marple returned to her cottage. Settling into her chair with a cup of tea, she gazed out at the green, now cordoned off with tape. Fresh footprints in the mud around the well, small, feminine perhaps, caught her earlier notice, and a single leather glove, half buried under leaves, embroidered with an initial E, Evelyn Hargrove, or a clever plant. As evening fell, casting long shadows over the thatched roofs, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The yarn unravelled smoothly, much like the threads of this mystery would in time. Suspects emerged in her mind. The vicar, Reverend Clements, with his financial woes. Mr. Potts, the innkeeper, burdened by loans. Mrs. Hargrove, possibly seeking freedom. Old Mr. Bumble, the gardener, who tended foxgloves and had quarrelled over wages. And Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, the postmistress, nursing an old family grudge. Curious indeed, Miss Marple murmured to her cat, Whiskers, who purred contentedly at her feet. The village well had yielded not water, but a wellspring of secrets. The game was afoot. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea. The day following the grim discovery in the village well dawned with a veil of fog that clung to the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, like a reluctant guest overstaying its welcome. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from chimneys where fires crackled against the autumn chill. Villagers went about their routines with a subdued energy, their conversations laced with the undercurrent of speculation that only a sudden death could provoke. At the bakery, Mrs. Baker doled out loaves with a shake of her head, murmuring to customers about poor Mr. Hargrove and what a shock for young Tommy. The post office saw a flurry of activity, as if the need to send letters provided an excuse to gather and exchange theories. Miss Jane Marple, ever the early riser, had already enjoyed her simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, accompanied by a pot of strong tea. She sat by her window, her knitting in hand, a soft pink wool this time, destined for a charity bazaar, watching as the fog began to lift, revealing the green in all its dewy glory. The cordon tape around the well fluttered gently in the breeze, a stark reminder of the previous day's events. Miss Marple's mind, however, was not on the scenery but on the human elements that had surfaced. Poison, the doctor had said. Digitalis. Such a common plant in English gardens. Foxgloves with their bell-shaped blooms, pretty as a picture but deadly in the wrong hands. Who among her neighbours possessed both the knowledge and the motive to wield it? Deciding that inaction was the enemy of insight, Miss Marple donned her sturdy walking shoes and a warm cardigan, then set out for a stroll. Her path led her inevitably toward the Blue Boar Inn, where the midday crowd would be thickest. The inn, a rambling building with low-beamed ceilings and a sign creaking in the wind, had stood for centuries, serving as the unofficial parliament of St. Mary Mead. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of steak and kidney pie, mingled with the hoppy tang of ale. Mr. Alfred Potts, the innkeeper, presided over the bar like a benevolent king, his broad frame and florid cheeks testament to years of sampling his own wares. As Miss Marple entered, pushing open the heavy oak door with a jingle of bells, heads turned in her direction. She offered a mild smile and made her way to a corner table, ordering a pot of tea and a slice of fruitcake. The room was abuzz. At the bar, a group of farmers in tweed caps leaned in close, their voices low but audible. Hargrove was a tight-fisted old codger, one grumbled. A man named Jenkins with dirt under his nails from the fields. Owed Potts here a pretty penny, didn't he? Threatened to foreclose on the inn if the loan wasn't paid. Mr. Potts, polishing a glass with a cloth that had seen better days, snorted. Aye, that's true enough. But I'd not poison a man over money. Besides, I was here all night, serving till closing. Ask anyone. His eyes darted around the room, seeking affirmation, and several patrons nodded obligingly. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he set down the glass, a sign of nerves perhaps, or merely the chill. Potts was a good soul at heart, fond of his wife and their brood of children, but debts could drive even the best to desperation. Sipping her tea, Miss Marple listened as the conversation shifted. "What about that young wife of his?" whispered Mrs. Weatherby, a plump housewife with a basket of groceries at her feet. Evelyn Hargrove, pretty as a film star, but half his age. I saw her flirting with Dr. West at the summer fete. Mark my words, there's more there than meets the eye. Giggles and nods followed. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Hargrove, a striking woman with auburn hair and a London accent, who had arrived in the village with trunks of fashionable clothes and an air of sophistication that set tongues wagging. Jealousy, inheritance, motives as old as time. Her reverie was interrupted by an invitation that arrived via the postboy, who handed her a note with a shy grin. It was from the vicarage. Reverend Leonard Clements requested the pleasure of her company for afternoon tea. "How timely," Miss Marple murmured, tucking the note into her handbag. She finished her cake, left a few coins on the table, and departed the inn, her mind cataloguing the whispers like entries in a ledger. The vicarage was a short walk away, past the churchyard where gravestones leaned like weary sentinels and yew trees cast long shadows. Reverend Clements, a scholarly man in his mid-50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, greeted her at the door with a warm handshake. "Miss Marple, so good of you to come. This dreadful business has us all on edge." He ushered her into the drawing room, where a fire blazed cheerfully and a tray of sandwiches and scones awaited. The room was cluttered with books, volumes on theology, history, and even a few detective novels, which made Miss Marple smile inwardly. As they settled with their tea, the conversation turned inevitably to the tragedy. "Mr. Hargrove was a generous donor to the church initially," the vicar said, stirring his cup thoughtfully. "But lately, we disagreed on the roof repairs. He wanted economies that I felt compromised safety, Still, to think of poison, it's unimaginable." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noticed how his garden, visible through the window, brimmed with foxgloves, their purple spikes swaying gently. The plant was a favourite for boarders, but its leaves, when distilled, could stop a heart. Clemens himself took digitalis for a mild condition, she recalled, prescribed by Dr. Haydock. Their chat was interrupted by a knock at the door. To Miss Marple's surprise, it was Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove herself, swathed in a black morning coat that accentuated her pale beauty. "Reverend, I came for solace," she said, her voice trembling artfully. "And Miss Marple, how kind to see you here." She accepted a seat and a cup of tea, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Reginald was everything to me. We had our differences, but who doesn't? He was so protective." Yet, as she spoke, Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality to her grief, like an actress delivering lines. And there was that faint scent of cologne, masculine, familiar. Dr. West's, perhaps. The widow confided softly. "He had enemies, you know. That gardener, Mr. Bumble, argued with him over some trivial theft accusation. And the innkeeper, well, money troubles." Clemens nodded sympathetically, but Miss Marple filed away the deflections. As Mrs. Hargrove departed, promising to attend the funeral arrangements, Miss Marple excused herself, her mind abuzz. Her walk home took her past the village green, where old Mr. Elias Bumble was tending the flower beds with his customary grumble. A weathered man in his 60s, with gnarled hands like tree roots and a cap pulled low over bushy brows. Bumble had served as the village gardener for decades. "Afternoon, miss," he grunted, not pausing in his weeding. Miss Marple stopped, admiring a bed of late-blooming asters. "Such lovely work you do, Mr. Bumble. I hear you had words with Mr. Hargrove recently." The gardener straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Aye, that I did. Accused me of pinching his gold watch from the manor. As if I'd stoop to that. Threatened to have me dismissed from my post." His scowl deepened, and Miss Marple's keen eyes spotted a fresh scratch on his forearm, red and angry, as if from a thorn or a struggle. "Was out late that night, checking the roses, against frost, but I saw now to miss." His shed loomed nearby, tools hanging neatly, including a bottle labelled for plant tonic. Could it contain digitalis extract for heartier blooms? Bidding him good day, Miss Marple continued to the post office, where Miss Lavinia Pinkerton held court behind the counter. A sharp-featured spinster in her late 40s, with pince-nez glasses and a penchant for knowing everyone's business, Pinkerton greeted her with a knowing nod. "Shocking about Hargrove, isn't it? I always said he was trouble. Cheated my late aunt out of an inheritance back in London. Family shares, you know." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "And his medicine cabinet? Stocked with heart pills. I saw the bottles when I delivered a parcel." Miss Marple purchased stamps, noting the tonic on Pinkerton's own shelf. Digitalis for her palpitations, no doubt. Evening found Miss Marple back in her parlour, cocoa in hand, knitting forgotten as she pondered. The glove by the well. E for Evelyn. The small footprints, Pinkerton's size. Bumble's scratch, Pot's debts, Clement's garden, the widow's composure, and that stranger sighted lurking. A travelling salesman peddling wares, whispered about in the inn. Too convenient, Miss Marple thought, a classic red herring to distract from local sins. The fog had returned with dusk, blanketing the village in mystery. But threads were emerging, tangled yet promising. Human nature, after all, unravelled with patience. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Garden. As the fog of the previous day gave way to a watery sun, St. Mary Mead stirred under a sky streaked with pale blue. The autumn leaves, now crunching underfoot like brittle parchment, added a melancholic note to the village's atmosphere. The green, still marked by the constable's tape around the ancient well, served as a silent sentinel to the unfolding drama. Villagers hurried about their errands with heads bowed, casting furtive glances toward the manor house, where black crape now hung in the windows as a sign of mourning. The air hummed with unspoken questions, and the church bells tolled a sombre reminder of mortality. Miss Jane Marple, having spent a restless night piecing together fragments of conversation and observation, rose with the dawn. She prepared her morning tea with deliberate care, adding a splash of milk and stirring slowly as her mind wandered over the suspects. The vicar, with his trembling hands and foxglove-laden garden, the innkeeper's shaky alibi, the widow's composed facade, the gardener's fresh scratch, the postmistress's bitter grudge, and that elusive stranger, whispers of a travelling salesman seen skulking near the well the night of the murder. Could he be the culprit, or merely a convenient distraction in this web of local intrigue? Determined to delve deeper, Miss Marple decided to attend the morning service at St. Mary's Church, where she knew the community would gather. The church, with its Norman architecture and stained glass, windows depicting saints in vibrant hues, offered a sanctuary of sorts. As she took her customary pew near the back, she noted the sparse congregation, fear, perhaps, keeping some at home. Reverend Clements delivered his sermon with uncharacteristic fervour, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he spoke of forgiveness and the frailty of life. "We are all sinners," he intoned, his eyes avoiding the front row where Mrs. Hargrove sat, veiled and solitary. Miss Marple observed how the vicar's fingers clenched the pulpit, knuckles white, a sign of inner turmoil. After the service, as parishioners milled in the churchyard amid the gravestones etched with faded inscriptions, Constable Slack appeared, his bicycle propped against the lich gate. He had set up an impromptu interview station in the village hall adjacent to the church, a squat building used for meetings and feds. "I'll be questioning folks today," he announced gruffly to the dispersing crowd. "Anyone with information step forward." His manner was officious, but Miss Marple knew from experience that Slack's blunt approach often missed the subtleties she prized. First in line was Mr. Potts, the innkeeper, who entered the hall with a defiant swagger. From her vantage point on a nearby bench, where she pretended to rest her weary legs, Miss Marple could overhear snippets through the open window. "Where were you the night of the 15th?" Slack demanded, pencil poised over his notebook. Potts replied steadily, "Behind the bar till closing, as I told you. Here's the ledger. Patrons signed for their tabs." The constable harumphed, flipping pages. "And this receipt here for a late delivery looks forged to me." Potts blustered. "Nonsense. My wife can vouch for me." But Miss Marple noted the innkeeper's wife hovering outside, her face pale. Family alibis were as sturdy as tissue paper in the rain. Next came old Mr. Bumble, shuffling in with dirt still clinging to his boots. "You argued with Hargrove over that watch," Slack accused. "Threatened you, didn't he?" Bumble growled. "Aye, but I left him breathing. Was tending the green till moonrise." The constable pressed about the scratch on his arm. "From Hargrove's nails, perhaps?" Bumble laughed bitterly. "From his thorny roses, more like. Check the manor garden if you doubt me." As he exited, Miss Marple rose and strolled casually toward the manor house, her walking stick providing a rhythmic accompaniment to her thoughts. The Hargrove estate loomed at the village's edge, a Georgian manor of red brick and ivy-covered walls, surrounded by expansive gardens that spoke of old money. Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove had invited her for afternoon scones, ostensibly to discuss funeral arrangements, but Miss Marple suspected a desire for company, or perhaps to gauge what the village sleuth knew. The widow greeted her at the door, her black dress elegant yet sombre, a string of pearls glowing against her skin. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to visit. This house feels so empty now." She led the way to the drawing room, where silver trays bore clotted cream and jam, the air scented with fresh-baked goods. As they sat by the bay window overlooking the gardens, Mrs. Hargrove poured tea with steady hands. "Reginald was a complex man," she confided, her voice soft. "He could be controlling, insisted on managing everything, from finances to my social calendar." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes drifting to the desk, where a letter peeked out, its envelope bearing a masculine scrawl and a whiff of cologne. "You must miss him terribly," she murmured. The widow's composure slipped for a moment. "We had our moments. He forbade me from seeing certain friends, you know." When Miss Marple gently inquired about Dr. Raymond West, her own nephew, but a handsome young man about town, Mrs. Hargrove blushed. "Raymond? He's been a comfort, nothing more. A kind soul in trying times." Excusing herself to powder her nose, Mrs. Hargrove left the room, allowing Miss Marple a moment to glance at the letter. It was innocuous, a note from Dr. West about a medical appointment, but the intimacy of the phrasing raised an eyebrow. Affair, or mere friendship? Returning, the widow suggested a walk in the garden. The air might clear our heads. They strolled amid the flower beds, where late roses bloomed defiantly. Mr. Bumble was there, weeding with vigour near a cluster of foxgloves. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Hargrove, tipping his cap. To Miss Marple, he added gruffly, "Them plants, harmless if handled right." Picking up a discarded trowel, Miss Marple felt its unusual heft. Could it have delivered a blow to subdue Hargrove before the poison took effect? And Bumble's scratch, matching the thorns on Hargrove's prized hybrid roses, suggesting a recent tussle. Bidding farewell to the widow, Miss Marple made her way back through the village, timing her arrival to coincide with the church fete preparations. The vicar had insisted on proceeding with the event, to lift spirits, as he put it. Stalls were being erected on the green, jams and preserves, knitted goods, a tombola for prizes. Amid the bustle, Miss Lavinia Pinkerton manned a table of second-hand books, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "Dreadful times," she clucked to Miss Marple. "I saw the vicar arguing with Hargrove right here, evening before last. Heated words over funds." When pressed, Pinkerton admitted, "I was behind the hedge, sorting mail. Habit of mine." Miss Marple smiled inwardly. Eavesdropping could mask deeper involvement. As the fete commenced, with children laughing over games and the vicar blessing the proceedings, a new rumour spread. The travelling salesman had been spotted again, fleeing toward the railway station with a suspicious bundle. Constable Slack, overhearing, mounted his bicycle in pursuit, his face alight with the thrill of the chase. "That'll be our man," he declared. Villagers nodded eagerly, relieved at the prospect of an outsider bearing the guilt, but Miss Marple dismissed it. Strangers were too tidy an explanation, like the contrived plots in amateur plays. With Slack distracted, Miss Marple slipped back to the well, now unguarded. Examining it closely, she noted the bucket's rope, frayed not from age, but deliberately cut with a sharp tool, perhaps to stage a fall or suicide. Nearby, glinting in the grass, was a button from a cardigan, embroidered with faint initials, LP. Lavinia Pinkerton, or Leonard, perhaps from the vicar's wife. Misdirection, she thought, pocketing it discreetly for later. Evening descended, the fate winding down with lantern light flickering like fireflies. Miss Marple returned home, her mind a tapestry of shadows and light. The tampered rope, the button, the salesman's flight, all pieces in a puzzle where human frailty was the key. As she settled with her knitting, the village clock struck 7, echoing through the gathering dusk. Tomorrow, she resolved, the threads would tighten. Chapter 4. Unraveling Threads. The autumn winds had gathered strength in St. Mary Mead, whistling through the chimneys and scattering leaves like confetti across the village green. The once vibrant foliage now lay in sodden heaps, mirroring the dampened spirits of the inhabitants. 3 days had passed since the discovery of Mr. Reginald Hargrove's body in the ancient well, and the initial shock had given way to a pervasive unease. Whispers followed villagers like shadows, and even the cheerful chime of the church bells seemed muted, as if tolling a perpetual warning. The constable's investigations had yielded little beyond rumours, and the travelling salesman's hasty departure, pursued fruitlessly by Slack to the railway station, had proven a dead end, the man merely a peddler of cheap watches with no connection to the crime. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the chill that seeped into her bones, had spent the intervening time in quiet contemplation. Her parlour, with its chintz armchairs and shelves lined with well-thumbed books, had become a command centre of sorts. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper, observations of footprints, the scent of cologne, the heft of a trowel, littered her writing desk. She had pieced together much, but the final knot in the yarn required confrontation. With a decisive nod, she dispatched invitations via the postboy. A friendly gathering over tea at her cottage that afternoon. The suspects, unaware of her intent, accepted out of politeness or curiosity, little knowing they were stepping into a web spun from their own deceptions. By 3 o'clock, the group assembled in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room. The fire crackled merrily in the grate, casting flickering light on the assembled faces and chasing away the external gloom. A tray laden with cucumber sandwiches, Victoria sponge cake, and steaming pots of tea sat on the lace-covered table, the aroma of bergamot lending an air of normalcy to the proceedings. Reverend Leonard Clements arrived first, his clerical collar slightly askew, carrying a bouquet of late asters from his garden. "A small token, Miss Marple," he said with a strained smile, "to brighten these dark days." She thanked him graciously, noting how his eyes darted to the windows as if expecting divine intervention. Mr. Alfred Potts followed, his burly frame filling the doorway, wiping his boots meticulously on the mat. "Afternoon all," he boomed, his usual joviality tempered by wariness. He settled into an armchair that creaked under his weight, accepting a cup of tea with hands that still bore traces of flour from the inn's kitchen. Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove glided in next, her morning attire impeccable, a veil partially obscuring her features. She murmured greetings, her gloved hands clasping a reticule tightly. Old Mr. Elias Bumble shuffled in behind her, cap in hand, his soil-stained trousers a stark contrast to the room's refinement. "Didn't expect this," he muttered, perching on the edge of a chair like a bird ready to flee. Finally, Miss Lavinia Pinkerton bustled through the door, her pince-nez glinting as she surveyed the group. "What an intriguing assembly," she remarked archly, helping herself to a sandwich without invitation. Miss Marple, seated in her high-backed chair like a benevolent queen, poured tea with steady hands. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice mild and unassuming. "In times like these, with poor Mr. Hargrove's death hanging over us, it's comforting to gather as friends. But I must confess, this is more than mere sociability. I've been thinking a great deal about the events, and certain threads seem tangled." The room fell silent, save for the tick of the mantel clock and the occasional clink of china. Eyes shifted, postures stiffened. The air thickened with anticipation. She began with the glove found near the well, producing it from her knitting basket like a magician's reveal. It was a fine leather affair, monogrammed with an elegant E. Mrs. Hargrove paled, her cup rattling in its saucer. "That's mine," she admitted softly. "I must have dropped it during an evening walk." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Indeed, and on the night in question. You were seen near the green, Evelyn dear. And that letter in your desk, from Dr. West. One might wonder if jealousy or a desire for freedom played a role." The widow's eyes flashed. "Reginald was possessive, yes, but I loved him in my way. I met Raymond only briefly that night, for advice on a headache. Nothing more." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple detected no outright lie, merely omission. Turning to Miss Pinkerton, Miss Marple presented the embroidered button, its threads matching the postmistress's cardigan. "Found by the well, Lavinia, and your footprints, small and precise, were imprinted in the mud." Pinkerton adjusted her glasses indignantly. "Spying, I'll admit to that. I overheard Hargrove arguing with someone that evening and followed out, of curiosity. But poison? Preposterous. My grudge was old, forgotten." She crossed her arms defiantly, but her gaze avoided the group, landing instead on the fire's embers. Mr. Bumble was next, fidgeting as Miss Marple referenced his scratch. From the roses at the Manor Elias, or from a struggle with Hargrove over that accused theft? The gardener scowled, rubbing his arm. "We had words, aye. He grabbed me, accusing me of stealing his watch. I shoved him off and left. Alive he was. Check the thorns yourself. They match." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And your knowledge of plants. Foxgloves in abundance near your shed." Bumble grunted. "For the bees, not murder. I'd sooner use me trowel for digging than bashing." The innkeeper shifted uncomfortably as attention turned to him. "Your ledger, Alfred," Miss Marple said gently, "shows a forged receipt for that night, covering debts to Hargrove." Potts mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "Aye, I fudged it a bit. Gambling losses, nothing more. But I was at the inn, serving till close. Ask the missus." His plea hung in the air, sincere yet laced with desperation. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Family alibis are touching, but often blind. Finally, she addressed the vicar, who had grown increasingly pale. "Reverend, your garden overflows with foxgloves, and your own tonic contains digitalis. The argument over church funds. Hargrove discovered discrepancies, didn't he?" Clement set down his cup with a clatter. "Minor reallocations for my sister's treatments. He threatened exposure, yes, but I appealed to his mercy that evening. No harm came of it." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the button's initials could as easily be LC for Leonard Clements, perhaps torn in a scuffle. As accusations swirled, the group erupted in murmurs. "It must be the stranger," Potts insisted. "Seen lurking with a bundle, probably the poison vial." Pinkerton nodded vigorously. "Or a hired hand from London. Hargrove had enemies there." Bumble grumbled agreement, while Mrs. Hargrove dabbed her eyes. whispering of anonymous threats her husband had received. The vicar remained silent, his hands clasped in prayerful pose. Miss Marple raised a hand for quiet. These red herrings are enticing, but let's examine the facts. The poison was administered at home, in Hargrove's evening brandy, I suspect, given his habits. The body was dragged to the well post-mortem, the rope tampered with to suggest accident or despair. No drowning, as the doctor confirmed. The clues point inward, to one who knew his routines intimately. She paused, letting the words sink in like rain on parched earth. The fire popped, underscoring the tension. Yet she held back the final revelation, allowing doubts to fester. Consider the tonic bottle, she continued. Emptied more than usual, perhaps. Eyes darted accusingly. Pinkerton had one, Clemens too. And the footprints overlapped, suggesting multiple visitors that night. Misdirection, layered upon truth. Miss Marple wove her narrative, watching reactions. Bumble's scowl, Potts's sweat, Pinkerton's huff, Hargrove's composure cracking, Clement's bowed head. As tea cooled untouched, the gathering teetered on revelation's edge. Miss Marple sipped her own cup, content to let the threads unravel a bit more. Outside, dusk fell, shadows lengthening like fingers pointing blame. The village clock struck 5, its chimes a countdown. Tomorrow, she knew, the gentle truth would emerge, binding the guilty in cords of their own making. Chapter 5. The gentle revelation. As the clock on Miss Marple's mantel struck the half-hour, the tension in her cosy sitting room hung as thick as the autumn mist outside. The fire had burned low, its embers casting a warm, flickering glow on the faces of the assembled suspects, each one etched with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The tea had long since cooled in their cups, the sandwiches untouched on the platter, as if the revelations thus far had stolen everyone's appetite. Miss Jane Marple, her frail form enveloped in a soft woolen shawl, sat serenely in her armchair, her blue eyes sharp and knowing behind her spectacles. She had unravelled the threads meticulously in the previous hour, exposing lies, half-truths, and motives. But now the moment of truth had arrived, the gentle unveiling of the culprit in this tragic village affair. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began, her voice soft, yet carrying the weight of certainty. "It is always a sorrowful thing to confront the darker sides of human nature, especially in a place as dear as St. Mary Mead. We are a community bound by shared histories, afternoon teas, and the simple joys of rural life. Yet, even here, frailties can lead to desperate acts. Mr. Reginald Hargrove's death was no accident, nor the work of some shadowy stranger from beyond our hedges. It was poison, digitalis, administered in his evening brandy at the manor house. Then his body unceremoniously dumped in the village well to mimic a drowning or perhaps a despairing end. But why? And by whom? The room stirred uneasily. Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove clutched her pearls, her youthful face pale beneath the veil. "It couldn't be one of us," she whispered, though her tone lacked conviction. Mr. Potts mopped his brow again, his ruddy cheeks flushed. Miss Pinkerton adjusted her pince-nez, her sharp features pinched in denial. Mr. Bumble shifted in his chair, his gnarled hands twisting his cap. Reverend Clemens, however, sat with his head bowed, his fingers interlaced as if in silent prayer, his earlier pallor now a ghostly white. Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap like a metronome marking the rhythm of deduction. "Let us revisit the clues, those everyday observations that so often reveal the truth. The glove, Evelyn, yours, yes, but dropped innocently during your clandestine meeting with Dr. West. a motive for freedom from a controlling husband. Perhaps, but your grief, though tempered, rings true. You sought solace, not murder. The widow exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging in relief. Turning to Miss Pinkerton, Miss Marple smiled faintly. The button, Lavinia, seemed to point to you. LP, embroidered so neatly. And your footprints near the well, from your habitual eavesdropping. Your old grudge over the inheritance provided motive, and your access to digitalist tonic for your palpitations added opportunity. Yet, you are a gossip, not a poisoner. The button was a plant, a misdirection, and your spying that night actually places you elsewhere when the deed was done. Pinkerton huffed, a mix of indignation and gratitude crossing her face. Well, I never, though I did hear raised voices from the manor. Mr. Bumble grunted as attention shifted to him. Your scratch, Elias, from the thorny roses, evidence of a struggle indeed, but one that occurred earlier in the evening. Hargrove accused you of theft, you argued fiercely, but you left him alive, storming off to your shed. Your knowledge of plants is vast, but your hands are for nurturing gardens, not ending lives. The trowel I examined? Heavy, yes, but unstained by violence. Bumble nodded gruffly, his scowl softening. Told you so. I'd not dirty me tools with such. Mr. Potts leaned forward eagerly. And me? The forged receipt was for hiding me gambling debts, not covering murder. I was at the Blue Boar, pouring pints till the wee hours. Miss Marple inclined her head. Quite right, Alfred. Your alibi holds, bolstered by loyal patrons. Debts drive many to folly, but not you to poison. Your heart is in your family and you're in. The vicar lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a resigned sorrow. The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl outside. Reverend Clements, Miss Marple said gently, her tone laced with compassion rather than accusation. It pains me deeply, for you are a man of God, devoted to your flock. But the threads lead inexorably to you. Your garden brims with foxgloves, the source of digitalis, and your own prescription for the tonic provided the means. The argument with Hargrove over church funds was no mere disagreement. He had uncovered your small embezzlements, those desperate transfers to aid your ailing sister's medical bills in London. Noble intent, perhaps, but fear of scandal drove you to folly. Clemence's shoulders slumped, tears glistening in his eyes. How did you know? He murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The others gasped, leaning in as Miss Marple elaborated. It was the tampered rope on the Wells bucket, frayed deliberately with a sharp knife from your garden shed, where I noticed a similar tool during my visit. You meant to stage a suicide or accident, but the shallow water betrayed you. No drowning occurred. The button, torn from your cardigan in the struggle, LC, for Leonard Clements, not Lavinia. And the footprints overlapped with yours, larger than Pinkerton's, leading from the manor path. You visited Hargrove that evening under pretense of reconciliation, slipped the overdose into his brandy, a lethal dose for his weakened heart, and waited until he collapsed. In panic, you dragged him to the well, hoping the village would assume a mishap. The vicar nodded brokenly. I didn't intend to kill him, only to make him ill, buy time to repay the funds. But the dose, it was too much. God forgive me. Sobs racked his frame, and Mrs. Hargrove reached out a tentative hand, her own eyes misty. You poor man, she whispered. Potts patted his back awkwardly, while Pinkerton clucked in sympathy, her gossiping nature tempered by the moment's gravity. Miss Marple rose slowly, her walking stick in hand, and moved to the window where twilight painted the green in soft hues. The red herrings, the stranger, the glove, the forged ledger, were coincidences amplified by our village penchant for drama. The travelling salesman, merely a peddler fleeing unpaid bills, as Constable Slack discovered. Human nature is predictable, my dears. Greed, fear, love, they weave the same patterns everywhere, from London salons to our humble cottages. She had sent a discreet note to Constable Slack earlier, and now the sound of his bicycle bell approached. The door opened to admit the gruff officer, who took in the scene with raised eyebrows. "Miss Marple, you summoned me." She nodded serenely. "Reverend Clements has something to confess, Henry. Handle it gently. He's a good man led astray." Slack, for once subdued, led the vicar away without fanfare, the group watching in sombre silence as the door closed behind them. As the gathering dispersed, the villagers lingered briefly, exchanging quiet words of comfort. Mrs. Hargrove embraced Miss Marple. "Thank you, for the truth, however painful." Potts promised a round on the house at the inn. Bumble muttered about tending the church flowers in the vicar's absence, and Pinkerton, ever the postmistress, vowed to spread only healing news henceforth. Alone once more, Miss Marple settled by the fire, Whiskers the cat curling at her feet. The village lights twinkled outside, a constellation of warmth amid the encroaching night. Peace had returned to St. Mary Mead, fragile yet resilient, like the first snowdrops pushing through winter soil. "All's well that ends well," she murmured, picking up her knitting. The needles resumed their click, weaving new patterns from old yarn. In the days that followed, the village healed. The well was cleaned and blessed, becoming a symbol of renewal rather than tragedy. Mrs. Hargrove found solace in Dr. West's company, openly now, their courtship blooming like the manor's roses. The church roof was repaired with community donations, and a new vicar arrived, bringing fresh sermons of forgiveness. Miss Marple, ever the observer, watched from her window, content in the knowledge that human follies, though recurrent, were balanced by kindness. And so, the mystery of the deadly corpse in the village well faded into lore, a tale told over tea to remind all that even in the cosiest corners, vigilance and compassion prevailed.